Good afternoon on today's Angry Bulletin. An old plan designed to reach Mars with a human crew by 2033 has been revived on the internet and is now making the rounds at NASA. It includes artificial gravity, nuclear propulsion, and by means of Starship, it could be completed by 2033. In fact, it's absolutely vital that the mission be ready by 2033, because if it isn't, we might not be going to Mars until the middle of the century. All of this and more coming at you on the Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to the Angry Astronaut. Before we get on to the topic at hand today, I would like to talk to you folks about the upcoming launch of Vulcan Centaur. As many of you know, this is an event that I've been waiting for eagerly for a considerable period of time, put a pretty substantial bet on the success or failure of this particular mission, and now I find myself about 3 weeks prior to launch in a situation to where I need to reach out to my supporters again to get me there. This is something that I don't really feel very comfortable with. So I'd like to make one thing very clear. And if you don't want to hear any more of this, well, just go ahead and skip to this point in the video and let's just talk about Mars from there. Okay, for those of you interested in the Vulcan Centaur launch, the trip out to Boca Chica and everything required there, well, it drained me substantially. And also, it's a trip that didn't really go very well as far as video quality was concerned, if we could even call it video quality. I didn't arrive in Boca Chica until just about 6 hours prior to launch, got 2 hours of sleep, and was setting up on a balcony 30 minutes prior to going live. And then to make matters even worse, I was supposed to be clipping on to a feed from one of my partners, and unfortunately that didn't work out either. So I was left in a situation without any sort of up-close visuals, essentially relying just on the equipment I was able to take with me across the Atlantic. It was a nightmare. In order to accomplish something a little bit more decent for the viewers this time, all I'm looking for is hotel, rental car, the cost of renting a Starlink. Other than that, I should be able to take care of everything else. My producer and I are getting together next week to do some equipment upgrades so that I can handle this filming myself. And when I say myself, it really is myself. I don't have a staff. I don't have an assistant. I don't have a cameraman for these sorts of events. Very seldom do I have anybody really helping me out. So I'm facing a much more difficult situation than a lot of my colleagues, but I'm not here to complain about that. I'm here to explain to you what I have in mind to try to make Vulcan Centaur an impressive thing. By the way, this is going to be a nighttime launch, early morning on Christmas Eve. This rocket is going to light up the horizon like nothing you've ever seen before. And also, I'm being given access to a gantry on NASA property just a few kilometers away from the launch site, way closer than the general public generally gets. I think it'll definitely be worthwhile, but once again, that's up to you. And I don't expect you to dole out any more support for me right now, given how generous you guys have been in the past. But all the details are in the description. I have repurposed my GoFundMe, if you want to go that route, or PayPal, Patreon, whatever. And let's not talk about that anymore. Let's talk about Mars. All right. So as far as the title of the video is concerned, NASA actually in the early 2000s had a plan for going to Mars in 2033. Why 2033? Well, we'll get to that a little bit later in the video. But at the time, the whole operation, the entire project, or just the difficulty of assembling a Mars ship in orbit, because you need to have a much bigger ship than an Apollo capsule to go all the way to Mars and back. Well, the process of assembling a ship in orbit was going to be ridiculously expensive and difficult to carry out. given the fact that the space shuttle was such an expensive vehicle to use, and even the shuttle wasn't going to have the cargo capacity to deliver some of the modules. Indeed, some of the ideas involved using some of the Soviet Energia rockets, the rocket that propelled their version of the space shuttle. Even though that rocket had been out of service for over a decade, NASA had an idea of reviving that program. But now we have Starship. Now we have a method of building a Mars ship, utilizing nuclear power, by the way, and getting it to Mars by 2033. How is this possible? And why is 2033 important? Ever since the early days of the Apollo missions, mankind has looked upon the red planet as the ideal and logical place for us to explore next, and an ideal place for us to set up a second human presence, far better than the moon because it has more gravity, because it has more resources, because it has at least something of an atmosphere, because its temperatures are less extreme. There are many things about Mars that make it a substantially better place for the human species than the moon. However, every year that goes by, and with every frustrating development with Artemis and Starship, Mars grows further and further away. And it seems less and less likely that people like Elon Musk and myself, who are roughly the same age, are actually going to live to see human beings set foot on the surface of the red planet. But there's no fundamental reason why that should be the case. And as I mentioned before, NASA has had a plan in the works since the early 2000s with the objective of going to Mars by 2033. Now, why is this year significant? Well, because as we have discovered lately, the sun has certain cycles, violent cycles that spew out enormous amounts of plasma and solar radiation at very inconvenient times. Right now, actually, the sun is especially active, and the astronauts on the Artemis 2 mission are going to be subjected to some of that solar radiation if they aren't careful. But fortunately, Artemis 2 and Artemis 3 are going to be pretty short missions. A mission to Mars involves many months, if not 2 or 3 years. During that time, it would be very inconvenient for a Mars ship to get bombarded by high amounts of solar radiation, something we'd like to avoid, and 2031 to 2033 is an ideal time to travel because the sun is projected to be in a quiet and calm state at that time. If we wait until the 2040s, things are going to get a lot worse, meaning that chances are we're not going to get another realistic opportunity until 2050, and I most probably will be dead by then. Now, one difference about this mission is it's not designed to set humans down on the surface of Mars right off the bat, but rather to establish an orbital space station, a manned station that is, around Mars first. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's a platform for the future exploration of the Martian system in general, and the Martian surface in particular. It's a close-up observatory, communications and navigation outpost for all kinds of scientific missions, both human and robotic. Now, the robotic missions are especially advantageous because you can control robots from an orbital station without the long 15 to 20-minute signal time back to Earth. And also, since the political and social discussions on contamination of the red planet has not yet been settled, the approach of having a space station orbit around Mars will be of great advantage. No matter what the outcome of the discussion is, the mission scenario will not be affected in general because it will provide a stepping stone for future exploration, assuming that putting humans on the surface of Mars proves to be politically impractical. Let's hope that doesn't actually happen, but it does provide a big advantage. It also includes a manned or robotic landing at any time suitable, carefully choosing landing sites, vehicles, and scenarios in order to scientifically explore life on Mars. Whereas Elon Musk's approach of sending Starship, Well, it doesn't even orbit the planet. Starship simply plunges to a predetermined landing site on the surface of Mars. There's no abort system, no method of calling off the mission. You just plunge through the Martian atmosphere at Martian terminal velocity, which, by the way, is about 1,000 kilometers per hour, as opposed to our terminal velocity, which is about 250 kilometers per hour, and at the last minute, pull up, hit the engines, and hope to hell you land safely. I feel that this approach is never going to be all that safe. Perhaps we can deliver cargo this way, but really utilizing a combination of an inflatable heat shield and parachutes is always going to be the safer way of putting human beings on the surface of Mars, and this mission accounts for all of that. So what does this Mars ship look like? Well, first of all, it's important to note that engineers are not digital artists, so these are going to be some pretty basic layouts. These are the dimensions of the modules that comprise the ship. Once again, it doesn't have to be aerodynamic, it doesn't have to be pretty, but it is pretty damn big. We're talking 18 meters in length, with 12 meters being the primary part of the module, with a diameter of 8.38 meters, which means it could fit inside the fairing of Starship. Originally, the idea was to launch one of these things using a Soviet Energia rocket, which had a fairing size similar to that of Starship. It's so unfortunate that the Energia ended up getting scrapped because it had many of the same capabilities, including reusability. I am confident that if the Energia had been allowed to proceed to its maturity, we would have had a moon colony by now at the very least, and a Mars mission would have been on the way. And by the way, this is the tragic scrapping of the Buran spacecraft that took place after the warehouse roof that was housing it collapsed, creating a serious safety issue. Perhaps the most advanced spacecraft that had ever been built by the human race ended up on the scrap heap. Disastrous indeed. But let's go ahead and move on to the ship itself. So now that we know what the modules look like, let's have a look at the overall layout of the ship. This is a nuclear-powered spacecraft. It actually has nuclear thermal engines to take it all the way out to Mars, and nuclear thermal engines designed to take it back from Mars as well. Item number 6 is the first stage of the nuclear thermal engines that are designed for the transport out to Mars, with number 7 representing the additional tanks. Nuclear thermal propulsion, by the way, for those of you unfamiliar with it, utilizes a nuclear reaction to superheat hydrogen and then to drive that hydrogen out the nozzle at about 120% faster than chemical propellant exits a rocket nozzle. What that means is you get over double the efficiency, and with other modifications, nuclear thermal engines can get from Earth to Mars in about 45 days. A big step up from a chemical solution. Number 5 is the second stage of the nuclear thermal drive designed to return the ship. Now, number 1 is the primary habitation module. Number 2 is the scientific module. And by the way, these are both in an artificial gravity environment, rotating at a sufficient speed to generate a 1/3 gravity environment in these modules. Not a full G, 1/3 gravity, because keep in mind, these astronauts are going to Mars, and we want to make sure that they're in a proper Mars gravitational environment so that they won't have to adjust when they land on the surface of Mars. It's also a lot easier to generate 1/3 gravity as opposed to a full G anyway. Also keep in mind that with all of these nuclear reactors, you have a hell of a lot of electrical power, meaning that you don't really need much in the way of solar panels, although you do need heat radiation to bleed the excess heat away from the ship. Now, the ship configuration is completed by number 3, which is the Mars Science Observatory. We'll get into the difference between that and the laboratory here in a moment. And then finally, the number 4 Surface Excursion Module, or the Mars equivalent of the HLS. So it's actually a pretty damn big ship if you look at all of these different modules, although, of course, a lot of that is being comprised of the nuclear thermal engines. Oh yeah, one other detail. This entire ship is actually designed to be a space station that stays in Martian orbit with the exception of component number 5. 5 is actually not just a nuclear thermal engine, it also has an entire self-contained habitation module. The idea is to establish a permanent presence in Martian orbit, maybe not leaving the astronauts behind, but what you have is a habitation unit similar to the one that's going to be left in orbit, and this is going to be returning to Earth. So here's a good opportunity to give you the layout of the entire habitation unit. On the first floor, you have the toilet and the shower, storage, a kitchen, also a living room, crew accommodations, a tunnel that leads up to the next level, a water tank. Now, you may notice that the water tank is kind of funny. It's not a tank, but rather a ring that encompasses the entire second floor. That's because the second floor serves as a radiation shelter, and water is the best possible protection against radiation. So if there's a solar storm of some kind, the crew can retreat to the second floor and hide behind a substantial water barrier. Also on the second floor, you have a medical center, the storage, or rather a second storage area, the control room for the ship, and a fitness area. And as I said before, this habitation area is duplicated in the artificial gravity part of the ship as well. Presumably then, the returning astronauts are not going to be in artificial gravity, but keep in mind, utilizing nuclear thermal propulsion, the transition time is only going to be about 45 days in microgravity. Much less time than International Space Station astronauts spend in that kind of environment. The artificial gravity is really for astronauts who are going to be staying in Martian orbit for a substantial amount of time. You don't have to be constantly transitioning from microgravity to Martian gravity and back again. Keep in mind, the idea is to establish a presence in Martian orbit more than a presence on the Martian surface. A Martian surface presence comes later. And another thing, as far as the surface excursion module is concerned, well, it's reusable and designed for at least 2 landings on the surface of Mars. That's another substantial advantage over the Starship scenario. Starship has to go to one pre-assigned landing location and it's committed, whereas this particular solution allows the astronauts to explore one location and then return to the space station if it turns out to be not the most ideal place to set up a habitat, and then explore at least one more location on the Martian surface before having to return to Earth. Although the landing vehicle is technically reusable, the landing process requires that it have a couple of replaceable components. First of all, during the initial entry, it has an inflatable heat shield similar to the Lofted that was tested about a year ago. That inflatable heat shield provides the initial deceleration and also protects the ship. Then the main engines are fired, decelerating from supersonic to subsonic speed. Then a parachute is opened on top of the landing vehicle to assist with braking, and after that parachute is jettisoned, the main engine is fired again for the landing. For a precise landing, LiDAR is used. It's very well developed now, much more developed than when this plan was originally conceived. The descending stage remains on the Martian surface, but there's an ascending stage that returns to the orbital station. Although this may seem somewhat wasteful wasteful, it does allow for an abort function. So in case something is going wrong during the descent, the ascent stage can abort the mission, fire its engines, and take the astronauts back to the space station. Once again, this is a function that Starship doesn't have. If something is going wrong during the descent with Starship, the crew is essentially doomed. What this means is you need a replacement descent stage and a replacement inflatable heat shield for each mission. Again, kind of wasteful, but it's built into the mass budget for this particular ship. And while we're talking about mass budget, well, let's go ahead and talk about the entire weight of the ship and how much less this actually weighs than trying to refuel Starship, the number of ships that have to be launched in order to send a Starship mission to Mars as opposed to sending this mission. The orbital station that gets delivered around Mars is 374.5 metric tons. The weight of the vehicle that returns to Earth, including propellant, is 121.9 metric tons. The total mass of the entire ship, including propellant, including everything, the space station, the return ship, all of that, is 756.3 metric tons. Yeah, that's a hell of a lot, but if you consider that it requires 1,200 metric tons of fuel alone to get Starship out to Mars, not to get it back, to get it out to Mars, this is actually a very mass efficient system, and it would require, if you're assuming about 150 tons per Starship mission, a mere 5 Starship launches to assemble this ship, and perhaps one more to transport the crew out to the ship, although you could probably do that with a Crew Dragon, so you're talking about 6 missions instead of 9 or 10 with Starship. And of course, the big difference is this is a mission capable of returning from Mars without any additional propellant, whereas Starship has to manufacture enormous amounts of in situ methane in order to get back from Mars. Many interesting advantages to this system. Oh yeah, and also because it's powered by nuclear thermal engines, it gets to Mars and back in less than half the time. Oh yeah, and one more enormous advantage. It leaves a permanent presence in Martian orbit, meaning that every time you come back to Mars in the future, there are lots of important components that you don't need to bring with you. As a matter of fact, if you leave an ongoing robotic hydroponic system on the station, you can have food waiting for you when you return to Mars, in addition to a reusable landing craft and other components and systems that you wouldn't have with a simple return mission. You would have a habitation module, you would have a science module, you would have a science observation module. Oh yeah, remember when I said that I was going to explain what that was good for? Well, some types of science can be carried out much better in microgravity than others that get carried out much more efficiently in full gravity, or 1/3 gravity in this case. This station has both solutions in one, and that are just a couple of many advantages that this system offers. I wish I could talk about it a lot more thoroughly, but I've already gone way over time. If you want to see more details about this fascinating Mars mission, I have all the details linked in the description. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and please subscribe. It's so important to the success of my channel. And please remember that if we really want to get to Mars by 2033, well, we're going to have to come up with a solution like this soon and start implementing it in a tangible way. So until we actually do that, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.